Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are on our second program in our what I'm calling Minorities Week. But I'm thinking about it; it may have been better to call it something else because already there's been a response of kind of is it just kind of preaching and things like that. I don't know. I will maybe consider renaming it in the future. But what we're doing this week is looking at subjects of participants in World War II who are in the minority. So we did the show yesterday about the Caribbean air crews in the Royal Air Force, and we're looking at Asian and female troops in the Red Army tomorrow. And so that's the subject. It's still World War II. It's still looking at engagements, battles. We're still looking at the outcome of World War II, but we're looking from the point of view, through the lens, if you like, of some of the minorities that participated. And I just want to say right at the beginning, we need to keep focusing on the idea that World War II was absolutely a global war. It touched every corner of the planet, numerous nations, numerous cultures, numerous political ideologies were involved in World War II. And the more voices we hear the experiences through, the better we will understand it. So if you are new to World War II TV, please don't forget to like what we're doing. Consider becoming a subscriber. Consider becoming a patron or a YouTube member. And also use the expanded description on YouTube there that has all the links you'll need to finding information about my guests, about social media links, about the different things we do outside and other shows that may have interest to you. But today, my guest is Dr. Jean Smith. She is studying and talking about race, migration. She teaches British Imperial History at King's College in London, and I'm delighted she's joining us. So good evening, Jean. How are you today?
Oh, hi. Well, thank you. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. So we've had some pretty niche subjects on this channel over the course of 2 years, and yours is fairly niche, although within a much bigger area. You know, your studies include, you know, race and migration and culture over, you know, a couple of hundred years, I'm guessing. But today we're kind of focusing really on the experience of the Allied troops of various different places who moved through South Africa. So just before we get into that, just exactly what is it do you do? What drew you to the kind of studies you do, and what are you working on at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, well, so you're exactly right that I'm not really a military historian. I'm a historian really of migration and race in the 20th century British Empire, primarily for my research. And what I'm going to present today is part of a much broader project that looks at the social history of movement and mobility around the British Empire during the war. So I got really interested in people who, you know, the fact that service personnel spent a lot of time you know, not only going to various battlefronts all around the world, but also kind of passing through various home fronts. And so, you know, basically it kind of sprung from there. South Africa is only one of the sort of home fronts that I'm looking at. Mostly I am interested in this experience of people traveling through home fronts or moving through them, coming to them for whatever reason, for training, because that's where they're being mobilized, because they're just stopping through there, as is the case for most of the troops that we'll talk about, you know, that I'm going to talk about tonight, coming through South Africa. So yeah, I mean, it's basically part of a bigger project looking at these themes and basically what happens when people move around the world in ways that they don't usually move, and what happens when people have kind of these particular kind of encounters where these people they're not local, they're foreigners, but they're also allies. So how do you kind of relate to them? How do you treat them? What do you do basically when your port city is flooded with thousands of, you know, young service personnel who are, you know, mostly men, possibly, you know, wanting to go a bit wild. So, you know, what happens basically? What are the kind of social consequences of all of these movements?
And I think it's important because we focus too often on the clash of the armies, the clash of the military forces engaging, but it was, of course, a global clash of cultures and language and traditions. And, you know, without World War II, the next 2 or 3 decades would have been very different because of these moving of populations, and look at the independence movements that sprang up across Africa and the Middle East and things like that, and civil wars in Greece and the breakup of the Yugoslavia and all these things there. So it's a clash of cultures, and I think we while people are always focusing on did the Panzer IV engage the Sherman tank better in North Africa or Italy, we're forgetting that these cultures are bumping into each other as well. And for many of them, it was their first time meeting people from outside their own state. When we talk about, you know, normally where I live, a lot of the GIs who waded up the beach on Omaha, that was their first overseas trip was over to England. The second overseas trip was across the Channel to Normandy, and they barely left their county, barely left their state. So when we're talking about, as we will do, people from New Zealand and people from Australia and meeting them with South Africa and the incredible mix of people that bumped into each other, it is really quite extraordinary. So you've come with a little PowerPoint of some information. I'm going to kind of hand over to you to kind of take us through what your little presentation is. And folks, we'll do some questions and things as we go along, and we'll do some others at the end. I don't know which direction we'll go this, because it's kind of all new to me, which is why I love these kind of shows, because I don't have a preconceived idea about the experiences, because it's something new we're tackling. So over to you then, Jean, really, and we'll jump in. Or I will jump in with questions and comments when I think it's appropriate. So over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much. I mean, first off, you might ask, why South Africa? That perhaps seems fairly obscure in some ways. And I actually first came to this question of what was happening in South Africa during the Second World War when I was doing another project, which was on British migration to South Africa and what's now Zimbabwe after the Second World War. And I found a huge folder in the archive of all of these people who had spent time in South Africa during the war and wanted to move there, basically. So, and then I started thinking, well, what were they doing there? What led them to, how long were they there? All of these kind of questions kind of arose for me. And many of them had married South African women, or had kind of, been offered a job, or all kinds of other things. And of course, the South African government is often trying to recruit white settlers. So, there was sort of that going on. And that's kind of where I first came to it. And I really, even though I had kind of been focusing on South Africa, didn't really know much about South Africa during the war. And I discovered that actually, I mean, other than the neutrality crisis, which, some of your viewers may be familiar with, the fact that it was actually quite a close thing that South Africa joined on the side of the Allies at all, and people, of course, maybe would know about Jan Smuts, given his role in the Imperial War Cabinet and so on, or they might know a little bit about South African involvement in North Africa, say, There's certainly certain points where you might, but more generally the South African home front. And I discovered that actually South African ports were really important, especially after Italy entered the war in 1940, and for 3 years after that, because of the difficulties of shipping through the Mediterranean. So basically the Cape route became about as important as it was before the Suez Canal, just for the purposes of Allied shipping. And so you have, and you can see here in my first slide, it's a kind of a watercolor view painted by a serviceman that, you had all kinds of shipping going through South African ports. So, we think that probably around 50,000 Allied ships, passed through at some point. And many of them were the so-called Winston Specials. So this is taking, British servicemen and women, mostly men, of course, to North Africa and the Middle East. But of course, you've also got people coming from Australia and New Zealand going to Europe. You've got people coming from India, people going backwards and forwards. And we'll get into that when I kind of focus in on some of my case studies, one of which is the kind of the Maori battalion, their experiences in South Africa. And South Africa was also a site for military training. So some of your listeners again, or viewers, may know about the Commonwealth Air Training Scheme. There's some of that going on in South Africa and Rhodesia. It was a site for naval training too. It was also a place where ships were refitted. So there's all kinds of things that are happening there in South Africa. It's where the invasion of Madagascar is launched from, so there, again, I really discovered that the more I looked into it, the more I realized I didn't know about what was going on there kind of during the war. And I think partly that's because the war doesn't feature very largely in the historiography or the history of South Africa itself. So it doesn't really fit into the kind of African nationalist narrative or the Afrikaner nationalist narrative. It's sort of like, well, okay, people know it happened, and there's some kind of funny stories about this dog that was adopted by a British naval, and so people talk about that, or they talk about the lady in white, this woman in Durban who would sing to the troops, but these quite kind of, nothing really very focused. So anyway, but you might be wondering too, okay, so now I've maybe explained a little bit about South Africa, why I'm interested in South Africa, why we're looking at South Africa during the war. Why troops of color? I mean, I think this is a particularly interesting situation where, of course, this is before apartheid, but it's still a segregated settler colonial society. But because of the kind of contingencies of war, there's a need often for allied troops of color, whether you're talking about troops from West Africa, from India, or or as I'll talk a little bit more about, Maori troops and so on. There's a kind of a need for them to stop and go through in the same way that other troops will. So you kind of have this clash between what the South African government might want, what the British government might want, what the kind of governments of, say, the New Zealand government, kind of, and how they're all going to manage the way that this kind of interaction might go.
Just to jump in, that anybody who is a person of color, if they're starting in, let's say, Australia, New Zealand, they're moving via South Africa to let's say they go to Canada and they go to UK, everywhere they're going, there are different classifications of how they would be treated. It's not like it's a constant for them. They're coming from kind of one demographic moving through another one, where they're not staying. And it must, we talk about a clash of cultures there. It must have been incredibly complicated. We talk about the mix of people, the faces you would see in Britain in 1940 and the number of nations took part in the Battle of Britain and things like that. But in South Africa, where you're surrounded by all these other countries that have different views on everything, and white colonials and tribal influences there, it must have been incredibly complicated. For everyone they have no frame of reference. If you happen to, I'll let you talk in a minute, but if you happen to be living on the edge of the harbour somewhere in South Africa, and there's people coming through, you wouldn't have any frame of reference of what kind of status these people have who you're seeing coming off those ships. There's no set of rules there, no mandate, so to speak. So I guess it would all just had we worked out on the spot.
Yeah, I suppose, many of these were quite, especially the port cities, would be quite cosmopolitan in a way. They would, they would certainly have exposure to people coming from different places. But I think this is just a case of the volume. And then the South African authorities are really concerned about, and initially they try to prevent Allied troops of color from landing in South Africa. That's the initial response. They try to stop it from happening. There's concerns that people won't kind of know how to behave. So they won't know, and then also that people might radicalize the local population, which is something, of course, that the South African government doesn't want. But there's also concern about white British troops not knowing how to behave in this setting, and this is I'm not really going to go much into this today, but I've written another chapter about which it looks at kind of the fears about interracial marriage, because there were all of these. I think in this case it was British. It was in the Navy, I think. Yeah, British, British sailors essentially that were marrying local women of color, which was still legal at that time in South Africa. I did some interesting kind of genealogical research about this. So there's this concern basically that people won't know how to behave, as you say, within the kind of particular kind of racial mores. But then again, the war itself also impacts on what's happening there and how people behave, and they're thrown into situations that they wouldn't normally be as well. So you're right. It is kind of being worked out on the spot to some extent. Although of course there are limits, and I think when I'm talking about how in some ways the war loosened up social boundaries between people, it certainly did, but there were limits to that, and I never want to lose sight of the very real and awful racial discrimination faced by many, and of course visiting people of color might be treated much differently than locals too. So then local Black Africans or local other kind of racial groups in South Africa, beyond that weren't white essentially.
Okay.
So yeah, and actually this might be a good point at which to talk a little bit about that, which is because I think sometimes the kind of different racial groupings in South Africa, if you're not a specialist, it might become a bit confusing. So of course, Black Africans, but then one group I really wanted to make sure to sort of talk a little bit about is the group that is, or the ethnic group or community that's usually called colored or Cape colored, because the term colored, I think, has a different meaning in North America and in Europe than it does for this specific case. So this is a specific kind of distinct ethnic and cultural group made up of people from a wide range of backgrounds. They don't only, but many of whom live near Cape Town or around Cape Town. So their backgrounds include the descendants of enslaved people from what's now Malaysia and other parts of Southeast Asia, also certainly European, also indigenous Khoisan and Xhosa people as well. And under apartheid, this group, colored, was a different categorization than black and different than white. Kind of, it fell within, within the kind of strange system of apartheid. This category fell in between, in the same way that Indian was a different category as well. So they're kind of, this group is treated differently. And the reason I'm kind of going into this is because they are ultimately, for the second time the Maori battalion comes through, it's decided that they are kind of most racially equivalent by this sort of weird South African racial logic to colored. So they should then be hosted by them when they come through again, so that would be the most appropriate kind of thing, to do. And I did find some pretty interesting evidence of some quite interesting kind of solidarity that formed between the Cape Colored community and the visiting Maori battalion too, that I'll talk about a little bit more, but just to kind of lay out a little bit about that sort of, just kind of a little bit about the background of what's going on in South Africa during the war and the different groups that are there. Let's see. And as I mentioned before, of course, the other thing is that there is opposition to the war in South Africa, probably most notably Afrikaner nationalist opposition, the Osawa Brandwag, the paramilitary wing of which is, committing acts of sabotage, harassing Allied troops to some extent. And mostly they're focused on South African troops, but I did find some evidence of people, saying that they've been warned that, they might get hassled if they did this or did that. But then there's also anti-colonial opposition to the war as well. So some people who are saying, well, it's hypocrisy to be fighting for democracy abroad when we don't have it here at home, pacifists as well. So it's quite a kind of complicated, picture. And what I'm talking about when I get into talking about wartime hospitality, that's probably quite a specific group in South Africa that's kind of offering that kind of hospitality. Tends to be, but not exclusively, Anglo-South African. There's really are kind of prominent, and for them it's a sort of a show of patriotism to show their affiliation to the empire, or if they're offering hospitality to Allied troops too. So just to kind of, I don't know, get a little bit of a sense of the kind of the sort of background of South Africa during the war. And let's see. So a lot of the hospitality that is offered to troops, and I'm going to kind of break down a little bit by what I mean by hospitality and why am I using this concept, and is it important, why am I so kind of fixated on it, is actually organized by the South African Women's Auxiliary Service. So that kind of becomes a sort of prominent. They seem to have been kind of tireless in organizing dances and canteens and to take people away on holidays and all of this. They sort of, when I start reading the records of this organization, you get this sense of these kind of mostly women who are just kind of forces of nature and are just kind of organizing a huge amount of events. And here you can see, for example, a leaflet that would have been given to troops when they arrived. So you can see here it says information for visiting troops, and it's got a little map. I'm sure it's it's probably difficult for people to see, but it will show people where they can go to a canteen, to a restaurant, recreation hall, dances, but also kind of more practical things like where the library is, and basically any kind of thing that you might need. And they did put on a lot of events for visiting service personnel. I think I was doing research in Cape Town, and I spoke to someone, and she was saying, oh yes, my mother used to complain about this, that she was forever being sort of told that she had to go to all these dances and dance with all of these visiting soldiers, and she just wanted to kind of stay home and read her book but so you kind of get this sense of a lot of kind of organized hospitality that's put on for visiting service personnel. And I think this is something that is worth kind of really complicating a little bit. So what is hospitality? What does it mean? And I think I've been kind of thinking about this a lot, and I think we really should be sure that we don't kind of conflate it simply with generosity, benevolence, and tolerance, even though it does have some aspects of that. It often was used as a way to kind of scrutinize, attempt to control visiting troops too. This is actually pretty explicit. Lucy Bean, one of the founders of SAWAS, when the first ships started coming through, she says, they hadn't got the infrastructure ready for them. They didn't have these leaflets, they didn't have these dances organized. And she, and I'll quote from her here because I think it's quite a telling quote. She says, "The men wandered aimlessly around the streets or spent too much time in bars, imbibing freely of cheap and potent South African brandy. Undesirable elements enticed some of the sailors into a district near the harbour that was notorious for illicit drinking, dacha or pot, that's a South African word for pot smoking, and other social evils that went on at squalid houses. Sailors went adrift." And, these are port cities. They have established red light districts that are already there. So, you can kind of see what's happening there. And so she's kind of in discussion with the British military authorities, like what do we need to do to kind of provide entertainment for the troops? And the trick is it has to be attractive enough that they'll actually go to whatever they're putting on, but it also has to be respectable. So they're kind of trying to find this middle ground between this. And, one commanding officer kind of succinctly put it, what you need is pretty girls and beer. And then that basically, and so they were always kind of skirting between this sort of line between what would be, what would actually get them to come, and then what is still kind of respectable. And I will say that these attempts to kind of control people aren't always really successful, so there is certainly a kind of power relationship between being the host versus the guest. But the guests also, in some ways, sort of possess the ability to disrupt that power relationship. So probably the most kind of, one of the most obvious examples of this I found was an Australian group of Australian service, I think they were soldiers, who basically hijacked a beer truck in Cape Town. And just, so these kind of, there are all these kind of unexpected things that might happen as well. And certainly I know from the other research that I've done, some of which I was just talking about, certainly people, service personnel, they were going to these illicit bars and shebeens, as they'd be called in South Africa, and brothels and so on. Absolutely that's happening. But they're trying to, whatever extent they can, possibly to offer a different kind of alternative and minimize that to some extent. Okay, so this is just kind of hospitality in general. But then there's particular challenges that come up when you're talking about visiting troops of color. As I've already mentioned, there's this kind of, the South African government is concerned about them coming at all. And they try to sort of prevent it. Eventually, it sort of becomes clear that that's not really feasible, just militarily to just, but they do place different kinds of restrictions on, visiting troops of color. But these, again, are hard to generalize because they depend on where they're coming from, the rank of the troops, how many of them are there. So if you have a small party of 20 Indian officers or something, obviously that's quite a different thing than having thousands of West African troops coming. So there's lots of different kind of reactions as you go along. And I'll just give a few examples maybe to get a little bit of a sense. But I mean, it is absolutely worth stressing that much stricter restrictions are placed on troops of color coming through South Africa for kind of obvious reasons, I think. So in June 1940, 4,000 troops from Nigeria, who were bound for East Africa, they were temporarily housed in a grain shed near Durban because the South African government didn't think it was appropriate to put them in the same facilities as the white troops. And then after this incident, they started to try, that's when they started trying to stop this from happening in the future, but eventually they gave that up. And then they actually built a separate transit camp for non-European servicemen near Durban. And so then when troops of color would come through there, they didn't receive shore leave. Their weapons were usually impounded while they were, and they were kind of put out on controlled route marches. There was this real sense of kind of tight control going on. But it's always a little bit more complicated than that, isn't it? So I found some other evidence that SAWAS also entertained West African troops when they came into Cape Town. So there's one occasion that I found where they were allowed ashore, but only for these kind of very specific organized entertainment. So then again, you see this kind of idea of hospitality. So half of them went to a picnic in Kalk Bay, the other half went to a swimming pool in Woodstock, and then they went to a lunch organized by the Cape Colored Women's Organization and a bus sightseeing tour. So it's not like they're all being put into this transit camp, but there's definitely a different kind of treatment going on.
And in your
there.
research, Jean, you must have, I'm assuming, had to do a lot of reading between the lines, because
Yeah.
when you're hearing that a unit that's, let's talk about the Maori battalion, for example, all these West
Hmm.
Africans are being contained in a particular transit camp,
Hmm.
they're not going to be, I'm assuming in many of the archives, they're not going to be saying we're putting them there because they're black. We're putting, it's going to be used, we're having to kind of trying to guess, are they there for their own safety? Are they there because they don't want them going? Because as you know, port towns, there's all sorts of troubles. You can get, Colin Taylor was watching earlier and saying when his 9th Battalion Drone Light Infantry went on shore leave in Cape Town, a lot of them ended up in the prison because they got into scrapes and fights and things like that. So all troops visiting a port, it's in the military's interest to kind of keep an eye on them and keep them in one place so they don't go rowdy. That makes sense. But if you're keeping them in one place because you don't want them to go out, it gets a bit, the lines blur a bit. And as you say, that when you said about hospitality, you can read that in kind of both ways, can't you? You're here because we want you to be here, but also you're here because we don't want you to be somewhere else. It's I'm guessing the reading between the lines was very important in your work.
Yeah, although you'd be surprised how explicit sometimes both South African officials certainly and British officials will be about why they're doing what they're doing. I mean, especially because, of course, a lot of the archival papers that I'm looking at weren't at all intended for public consumption till many years later, So certainly they will, some of it is very explicit. We can't have them here. They might radicalize the local Black population, or we need to, think about what, oh no, all these men are marrying women of color. What do we do? The difference, I think, is that the British authorities usually they don't want to have this kind of explicit racism in their public appearance. So they'll do things like they'll say, oh, in cases like this, can you see about transferring the man before he actually marries, or as opposed to just saying, no, you can't do that in the same way. So there are some differences of approach, and of course, the South African and British authorities are often at odds with each other about what's happening and what they would prefer to happen. But so I agree. There's some reading behind the lines, but some of it is just really, really explicit. There sort of isn't much room for a doubt about what's happening. I mean, I think one thing that and I've been able to get more of a sense of the perspective of Maori soldiers because of some research I was able to do in New Zealand, and I think because the Maori battalion, people are really interested in the Maori battalion. They've done all these oral histories of veterans and so on. You can kind of get that more so than I've been able to do for some of these other troops, really. But so that's another limit of the research too, what their experience of it all was, what they made of it, what they thought. But I mean, you're right that in some sense it could be that there's a for your own protection. I'll get into this a little bit more. It's unclear sometimes whether the New Zealand government was trying to anticipate what the South African government might object to and act before, or if it was the South African government saying, "Oh, we really don't want you to land the Maori." So it's a little bit unclear, I think, at times. Um, yeah. Yes, I think maybe the next kind of thing is maybe a few more examples of sort of what happened to some troops as they came
Yeah,
through, if that
please
would
do.
be, yeah, kind of useful. I mean, I think one thing I will say is that I did find some evidence that the kind of the sheer volume of people coming through started to put a bit of strain on the infrastructure of segregation, because if there it was just difficult to maintain that if you've got these, so they kind of put out an appeal in 1941 to Indian and kind of the Cape Cod community if they could host some more canteens, and they could make more of an effort too. So that's something else that I found to be quite interesting, that even though the government might have this intention, sometimes the kind of practical realities of the situation might overcome them. But yeah, so another example I found was a group of Indian soldiers that were sent to guard Italian prisoners of war, and there was a lot of controversy about this in South Africa because, the notion of Indian soldiers that were then guarding white prisoners of war was kind of a bit of a problem, for them and their racial ideology. And I guess the way that they got around it, so far as I can tell, and there's other people who've written much more about prisoners of war camps in South Africa and elsewhere, Australia and elsewhere. They weren't guarding German prisoners of war, and because again, there's this racial hierarchy about Southern Europeans and North, none of it really, But anyway, so that was still already a bit difficult. But then they also had a manpower shortage, so they were sort of wrestling again with these practical kind of problems. Okay, so their British authorities are a little bit worried about this group of Indian soldiers who are being sent there. And I think, I had a look at some of the documents about, what happened basically. And this is, I think, maybe where reading between the lines was more useful, So, they say, they have really good reports. Oh, Durban has been treating the Indian contingent that we've sent very well. There had previously been complaints about Indian officers not being allowed into a restaurant in Cape Town. And, they really were concerned about not wanting that to happen again. And but then when you hear all the details of what was happening, again, it's again back to this idea of hospitality as a means of control, because they'll say, as it reads, Durban Club has welcomed the Indian officers, to whom hotels and cinemas have also been opened. The Indian community are looking after the other ranks, and the soldiers' clubs have been open to them. Blocks of seats have been reserved in the White Cinema. Special transportation has been put on for them. And so that sounds kind of nice until you start to really think about it. It's like, well, no, actually, they've been given this segregated experience of these things. And again, you see the difference there too, the kind of class-based or sort of officer versus other ranks kind of distinction coming up too. So again, this idea to kind of contain visiting soldiers of color through the provision of separate facilities. And again, I'll stress, and I can show you my next slide. This was quite a different experience for most white troops who came through South Africa, for the most part. Most of the memoirs that I read, and letters and things that I read, there's some that are critical of the South African government, certainly, absolutely, that does come up. But for the most part, they just have a great time, basically. The hospitality that's laid on for them, there's not rationing in the same way. The way they describe food that they have available to them there, it's just really, really vivid, because even, compared to what they might get on ship or what they might get, or even in the UK, the South Africa actually had more fruit available than usual because of difficulties with exporting, so it's just a kind of different, the way they describe it is really different, I think, than what I'm talking about here. I mean, I think probably my favorite story is this one man who describes going out for dinner, and he describes every course that he ate, finished by a banana split, and then how after he had finished it, he just ordered the same thing again, because it just so this and here you can see some of these British service personnel being welcomed. So this is a really, really kind of, and for many of them, I suppose it might have been sort of their last stop before they went off to North Africa or wherever, their last kind of prolonged stop too. So it might also have lingered in their memories for that reason, as well. But yeah, okay. Okay, well then here's a few other examples. So this is taken from the perspective, because I have the memoir and I have the papers of the South African Women's Auxiliary Service. But so that is a particular kind of perspective, but it is still quite interesting. And Lucy Bean, who was one of the founders of it, she was quite frank about a lot of the difficulties that she would have. So she said, for instance, that she kept a special roster of white women in Cape Town that she knew would be willing to go to dances with officers here. Now we're talking officers of color, so Indian officers, and any officers that would come through. So she had like a special list of women that she knew she could kind of invite. So it's interesting because it kind of indicates that there is this sort of openness in some ways, but it's very limited. You have to have a special list. You have to make sure you don't invite the wrong women, or you might kind of offend them.
And the assumption that officers are somehow better than the other ranks. I mean, as it's going in the sidebar there, this is not only a topic, a discussion about racism, it's classism as well. It's
absolutely.
It's both those, and I guess sexism as well. When people of color who are female came through, that brings in another set of variables into this whole situation.
Yeah, and I haven't actually found too much information about women of color. I'd love to find out more. I did find some African American women who basically just said they didn't want to get off the ship. So, which is fair enough. But that didn't really tell me much more about their experience and stuff. So that's absolutely, I'd if anyone has any ideas or any, suggestions about sources about that, I'd love to read more about that, or I'd love to do some more research about that. But there is this kind of sort of worrying. So they're organizing all these events. She writes about how there's a concert that they had given for, which included soldiers from Indonesia, and there's she had this concern when it kind of spontaneously turned from a concert into a dance. And, so none of the women that were there ended up objecting, but then she had this threatening phone call later about this turn of events. And it got me thinking about this kind of idea that, what is kind of appropriate, or different kinds of sociability or hospitality, right? So they might be fine for you to be sitting, at a concert, everyone's all sitting kind of, but then an actual dance is, maybe considered to be differently. And I think Wendy Webster's work on the Mixing It, her book Mixing It, basically, she talks about this. But again, it's different in the UK, because there it's sort of like, okay, well, it's fine in a public dance. And I think David Reynolds has written about this too. But so you wouldn't necessarily invite someone back to your home. That would be that would be considered differently. So I think it's kind of important to sort of really think through of these, So and these little instances, they show the kind of potential for more open interaction than you might expect, but then also the limits, I think, at the same time. Okay, but let's talk a little bit about the Maori battalion. As I said, I have more information about them, than I do about most other, most of these other people who came through. So the experiences of the 28th Battalion of the second New Zealand echelon, often called the Maori Battalion, I think it really illustrates quite well the ambivalence of wartime hospitality that I've been kind of talking about. So you can see both conflict and conviviality in the encounters that they have. And, I was mentioning this to you before we started. This is quite fragmentary, right? So I'm talking about 2 visits that they had during the course of the war, of a few days, 5 days. I think the second one, I think it's in the end, it's 3 days for the first one. So this is 8 days in their experience of the war. But I think it is still interesting to sort of look at what happened then, and what maybe, what we can kind of draw from these sort of fragments, start to put them all together and come up with hopefully a kind of bigger, wider picture. So now the Maori battalion, Maori actually served in all branches of the armed forces, but the New Zealand government, responding to calls from Sir Apirana Ngata and other Maori MPs, they specifically formed an all-Maori combat battalion at the outset of the war. And this was different, than the First World War, the Maori Pioneer Battalion, which was largely in a support role rather than a combat. So this is a very kind of specific difference, I think, here. And it was a frontline infantry battalion. And they visited South Africa twice during the war, as I mentioned. And so here you can see, and I think this is quite an interesting thing. It's from a newspaper, a kind of a troop newspaper, and it shows the sort of their sort of first set of places that they visited. And I don't know, it might be difficult to see, but what's interesting is the cartoon is itself entitled "The Tourist," so it kind of just gives you a little bit of a sense of how they might be experiencing what's happening to them. So of course they're going to war, and but also they're going to Australia and South Africa and British West Africa, and then England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland, and then at the end it says what next, So it is also this kind of experience of tourism and travel as well, alongside all of this. But so I think what's also notable about this, and this is not specific to the Maori Battalion, it's the broader kind of New Zealand contingent here that's being depicted, as you can see in the South Africa, well, hopefully you can, it's probably might be a bit small.
No, we can see it. It's good.
Yeah, okay, oh great. I mean, so it's basically people, 3 men that are welcoming people to a car, so which is kind of, again, kind of indicating this hospitality. I read loads of accounts of that, how there'd be people lined up at the harbor ready to take people off and basically entertain them. So here you can see Maori soldiers were initially quite apprehensive about what might happen to them when they arrived in South Africa, and they were actually warned about it too by their commanding officers. So they mention being kind of told, okay, you may encounter a cool reception, don't make a fuss if you get turned out of a shop or something like that happens. So again, you can kind of see this attempt to sort of manage these various relationships through the authorities. And here you can see actually 3, and I think this is what you chose for the sort of the image for this talk. Yeah. The 3 members of the Maori battalion with a kind of very blurry Table Mountain in the background, which is quite hard to see, but it is there. And this is, I think, from the first visit to South Africa. And there was a delayed landing. There was a lot of uncertainty about whether they would get shore leave. And again, this is a little bit unclear. So at first, two ships aren't able to land, and it's, is it because of the conditions? Is it because of, and then they end up moving to, I think they go from Cape Town Harbor to Simonstown, or they move around a little bit. And it's a little bit unclear. But then the next day, the Pakeha, or white units, are let off for shore leave, whereas the Maori battalion is still on ship. It becomes clearer. But then but then this is the point that I've never, I've talked to some historians in New Zealand about it, and they seem to think that this was the South African authorities doing. But it's unclear from the sources. Is it the New Zealand authorities not wanting to antagonize or cause any problems with the South African authorities because they know or they're expecting what might happen? Or is it the South African authorities saying, no, don't let them? I haven't been able to find out. But either way, eventually it's decided that it's fine for them to go on shore leave. And they have permission to go to the city. And so this is now the fourth day after they've arrived in Cape Town. They've been on the ship all these days, kind of, and then they go on, again, it's the same kind of slightly controlled hospitality. So they go on a bus tour. Many of them talk about how the countryside reminds them of New Zealand. They march then to a drill hole where the mayoress of Cape Town hosts them for a luncheon. And they perform several Maori songs, or some members of the battalion do. And, there's all these comments about how great the singing is and so on. And the courteous manners and splendid physique of the troops. That's the kind of description that you get from the Sawa's side of things. So, because I'm kind of looking at a few different kinds of records, the South African records, the New Zealand official records, the women who were doing the hosting, and then, as I'll go into a little bit more, actually some of the experiences of the Maori battalion too. And there is this kind of interesting kind of notion of Maori, in line with some of the martial races kind of thinking, so there's a certain way in which that kind of comment fits into those sort of stereotypes, I think, about them. Now, up until this luncheon, they're pretty tightly controlled, but then they're given an hour of free time to see the city. And so here you can see a few different discussions of this. So the official history says, the troops strolled quietly around and were received in the shops with civil curiosity. Not only were no incidents of any kind reported, but all the troops were accounted for when the convoy sailed. So that's the official history. Major Clifton, one of the commanding officers' account, he says, none missing, none drunk. So that's his concern, But then the recollections of Maori veterans themselves are quite different. Monty Sutar, for example, he says many of them didn't follow the order to return after an hour. Some returned later that night. Military police had to be sent out to find some of them. One of them, 2002, and I should say Monty Sutar is not a veteran. He's a historian of the Maori Battalion. Yeah, so I just realized that where I said that it might have sounded a bit confusing. He cites a 2002 oral history interview with Takawa Moana Bill Delamere, who describes going to an engagement party that he was invited to. I think it's a little bit unclear, but it sounds like by, some Black African people that he met, in Cape Town, and, the boys got stuck into the grog is what he says. So, there's all these kind of different accounts of what actually happens. I think it's important to kind of sort of say that we don't really know exactly what happened, right? We just have all of these little accounts from different directions. Certainly it seems, though, regardless, that the visit went reasonably well. So that the second time they came back, on the way back, so this is after they've been in the UK for training, and now they're heading to North Africa to fight. There's not the same delay again, right? So they wire through to us, the South African authorities, and they say, yes, they should be treated the same as any other Allied, or any other British, I think, I'm trying to remember, any other Allied troops, basically. But then still, when they land, I think what's interesting is in the accounts, so I have some accounts that I've looked at by white New Zealand soldiers who were kind of in, stopping in the same time, and then also from Maori soldiers. And they both they see a lot of racism that they write about, but mostly they don't tend to experience it themselves. So they tend to have this sense that they're treated differently than the local people, perhaps. Or they might have a kind of experience where, they see all these signs saying whites only or whatever, and they feel quite alienated. But then a white South African will buy them. There was one case where he bought them all the fruit that they were trying, that they were getting, or, so they have this kind of slightly ambivalent kind of, slightly different experience than perhaps they might necessarily be expecting.
I mean,
And
just to
I
jump
think,
in, I mean,
go ahead.
it's
Yeah.
intriguing as to whether the Maori Battalion, we're referring to them today as the Maori Battalion, but they are, of course, part of the New Zealand Army. And when the ship was anchored in the harbour there,
Yeah.
were they perceived by the harbour authorities that as being New Zealand troops first, Maori second, or Maori and Black first, New Zealand second? Because we had the question from Ian Carr watching, had the New Zealand play rugby in South Africa, and I was Googling while we were talking, and yes, the first New Zealand rugby tour of South Africa was in 1928. But in looking at the photo of the team, they all appeared to be white in 1928, but I don't know by the 1930s whether or not there were Maori members of the rugby team. Had South Africa had any contact with Maoris prior to World War II? You may know the answer to that, or it may be going down a rabbit hole.
No. I mean, I have looked into this a little bit, because on one account I found they talked about encountering, it was an encounter between someone who had been on the South African rugby team that toured in New Zealand, I think in the 1920s, but now, I'd really have to look it up. And it was quite controversial that they played a match against an all Maori rugby team. And so it was controversial in South Africa. And so, so there is, I think there is some knowledge about Maori, and I've also found some evidence that some of them did stop in South Africa during the First World War as well. But I've never kind of gotten enough information about that to really satisfy what happened, or what and it kind of ended up being too far of a byway for me to really pursue. So but I mean, rugby is an interesting point, because one of the other things I'm going to say, or we'll talk about a little bit, is so in the second visit, it's decided that it's appropriate for the Cape Coloured community to host the Maori Battalion. And I've managed to find this very, very blurry, but still quite interesting photo of the dance that they held for them. So this is mostly Maori soldiers and so-called Cape Coloured women. I'm sure there's also some coloured men as well. And there is this kind of interesting, lasting sort of relationship between Maori and Cape Coloured or coloured community in Cape Town, especially. There's this kind of known phenomenon that they would always support the All Blacks, for instance. And, so there is some kind of interesting form of solidarity that emerges. And, I think, we've been talking a lot about conflict, and I think that is really important. But there is also the other side of this, which is, conviviality, kind of, people that kind of feel a certain kind of solidarity, and, so, I think cooperation, absolutely, that's that other side of this too. So I mean, and because, again, as I mentioned, the Maori Battalion have, they sort of, especially after people are really interested in them, and there's all these oral history projects that have been done, and there's a great website devoted to the Maori Battalion, which I've found some information on too. I have been able to find more information, and that's why I've ended up focusing on them more, perhaps, than some of the other groups. Just it's there. It's it's kind of, well, I mean, if you can go to Waihuru in New Zealand, which really is in the middle of nowhere, you can access it. But so they really describe the second visit, the veterans themselves, in really glowing terms. So what's interesting is, a lot of times the kind of histories that are written later will emphasize the first visit, will emphasize the fact that they weren't landed, and this and all that. But the actual veterans themselves, they talk more in what I found about the second visit that they had. What a great time they had, and particularly mentioning this dance. The juice flowed, the wine and beer flowed, all free. 3 soldiers actually did not report back to the ship in time and were left stranded in Cape Town. I mean, I'm sure this kind of thing happens all the time, but they were later picked up by the military police, and they ended up rejoining the battalion sometime later in Egypt. One of them, Terry Tahena, and I found this from this interesting website where people kind of submit their family histories too about the Maori Battalion. His nickname back home was Cape Town Jack, because he had kind of basically, I guess, kind of ended up staying there longer than he was supposed to. So this kind of, even though it is a fleeting moment, it has this kind of longer life, I think, than just what you would expect a 5 days visit to sort of to be. And then, also in the research I did, I found some of the Maori veterans talking about that they also had kind of ongoing friendships with South African troops, even white South African troops in Egypt and, and elsewhere where they served together, So yeah, it's interesting, one of the, I think this was being done in the early 2000s, this oral history interview, and the interviewer is basically kind of prodding the the Maori veteran to say like, oh, well, when you went to South Africa, weren't they really racist to you? And the veteran is kind of pushing back and saying, no, actually, no, that wasn't my experience. Like, don't, I don't want you to sort of put your preconceptions of what would happen or onto what happened. And, he says something like, there's a war on, everything's forgotten on the football field, that there is this kind of interesting sort of, and I don't want to romanticize that too much, but I do think it's important to sort of think about the complexity of this, that it wasn't just one thing or another. It was kind of, more complicated than that, really. I think, one other thing that I found quite interesting, and this, I'll have to thank Jonathan Fennell, who's a colleague of mine at King's, who has done a lot of work on censorship summaries, looking all around the British Empire. And he let me know about these, which is basically digests of, the censor would read a certain percentage of letters and they would kind of write a little bit of a report, like sometimes quoting the letters, so what are these soldiers writing about, kind of, getting a sense of that. And he found, using that, there's an example of someone from the Maori battalion, a Maori soldier, writing to a coloured woman in Cape Town, and they're discussing anti-colonial politics, and they're kind of forming some kind of, going back and forth, and she's asking him about what the situation is in New Zealand, and he's saying, well, it's actually, probably just as bad as South Africa, only they don't make it as obvious, like they have this sort of back and forth that's going on that I think is quite interesting. And he's asking her, they're talking about what would happen if South Africa was invaded. Do you think Smuts would arm Black Africans? And she says that she doesn't think he would, but also they wouldn't want to fight anyway, and so they're having this quite interesting, quite political discussion, that then again, this is just a little fragment that happened to get into the censorship summary, and that's how I've been able to sort of find out about it. But there's that, and then there's also other evidence that I found of people kind of trying to look up, people that they met in Cape Town, possibly at this dance many years later, or talking about how they corresponded with them for a few years and then they lost touch and so on. So I think that it's a fleeting thing, but it is also something that is has a longer life too, and that is kind of worth considering when we kind of think about the longer term legacies of the war too. Yeah.
Oh, definitely, and I mean it's raising lots of. I like a show that raises as many questions as it does answer them, because there's conversation in the sidebar saying the Maoris, they're kind of exotic, they're novelty perhaps compared to people from West Africa or East Africa passing through so, and they're lighter skinned. Let's not ignore the fact they're lighter skinned. So it would be easy to just assume that every person of color who went through South Africa in World War II had a shit experience. That would be a very easy assumption to make, and clearly it isn't the case. And clearly there are very different situations depending on what point of the war and in what quantity people are coming through. I mean, we had the question earlier about, was there any attempt to, for example, when wounded came back from the front to South Africa, were hospitals in any way, were white patients treated differently to black patients, things like that? There's lots of complexity there, because we were talking with Mark Johnson yesterday about the Caribbean pilots. I can imagine if a boat of RAF air crews on their way to the UK came through Cape Town, and on that boat were white Australians, white New Zealanders, white South Africans, Caribbean pilots. You can't start singling out and say, well, okay, you're black, you can't go in this club here. They will be treated better because they're in a mix than a unit that's coming through that are all of color. So
Yeah.
I can understand it's very complicated to research. It's very complicated to understand it. And therefore, my question to you is, what conclusions, if any, can we kind of draw at the moment about how South Africa represents either, does it represent the world? Is it unique to South Africa? What have you discovered? What have you determined?
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess I'll do the usual historian's dodge and say both, really, because I mean, it is unique. It is a very specific place that has a particular history, and so on. But then I found similar things looking when I've done research in Australia too, in terms of, and here it's mostly now African American troops and how they're treated, and how there's all this worry about what to do about them, or how they should be treated. So I think it's yeah, it's hard to come to any kind of final conclusion about it, other than to say that I think the sort of unique context of the war brings a lot of these things up to the surface and kind of makes them more visible. They have to be negotiated. They have to figure out what to do. They've got a shipload of people coming. So I think it points to the difficulties of maintaining a system like this, just the kind of difficult practicalities of doing it. And then I think also, I did find it really interesting to see the British official response. And I found this to be the case in other contexts too. I've done some research into British attempts to get Black RAF personnel from the Caribbean to return home after the war, because they couldn't force them to, because they have rights as British subjects to stay if they want to, but they wanted them to. So they're trying to, but they feel they need to use these informal means of getting people to go back. So kind of coming up with a procedure, it's a more sort of informal way of handling these issues. And so you see the same thing in South Africa, where the British authorities are, in some ways, they seem to be sympathetic to what the South African authorities want to do, but they're not willing to be as explicit. And perhaps they can't for various reasons. So that was something else that came up for me, is how these things are negotiated, really. Too. That's not much of a conclusion. It's more of a ramble.
Well, no, I mean, often we don't draw conclusions. That's I think that sometimes one of the good things about a YouTube channel is if you're doing an academic paper, often you have to have a conclusion at the end. Otherwise, there's no point to it. But this, we can just discuss a subject and then kind of say, well, okay, well, we've not reached any firm conclusions, but we'll bring it to an end. But in this case, I think what is interesting, and it seems to be my experience of understanding, and we've talked about the Polish troops in Britain in World War II and things like that, is in many ways World War II reached a peak of cooperation and things got worse again before they got better. That's the tragedy, is that improvements clearly were made, and there was a sense of community. And we talked about the Indian troops and how Pathé were filming all these wonderful Sikhs, and the artillery pieces being going down Pall Mall in London in 1940, and the pride the British Empire had in demonstrating its multicultural background to win the war. But things took a dive after the war, and I'm guessing, well, we're not guessing, we know that South Africa, it got a lot worse before it got better. So that's interesting, is the needs must have having to cope with, as you said earlier, nearly 50,000 ships going through South Africa, and all these people came, they had to find solutions, because there absolutely was a war to win. But after the war, when there absolutely wasn't a war to win, maybe an equality war to battle, the priorities shifted, I guess.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think the war is a very, very specific context for all of this. You wouldn't have this kind of, SAWAs, the South African Women's Auxiliary Service, organizing all these dances, and you wouldn't have a special roster of women that will dance with Black men. This is all kind of very specific kind of wartime phenomenon.
No, definitely. And I guess it wasn't, as you said, it wasn't like much of this stuff was actually kind of policy driven. It was kind of finding solutions as they came up. There's a ship arriving with such and such on it. We must find a way of accommodating them. And as you said there, the fact that the New Zealand battalion, the Maori battalion, may have preempted the problems and set their own rules up. And that's standard military practice. If you're taking your army through a port where there are temptations and alcohol and girls, you may want to enforce restrictions because you've got a battle to fight in a few days' time. You don't want everybody getting arrested or getting drunk, and so it is a complicated, nuanced subject. But I don't think there's any particular questions coming in. People are just saying they're enjoying it and it's been interesting and raising more questions. I'm just checking. I don't think there's any questions there. But to kind of round things off, what would you like to be done next, and not just your own work? What areas do you think can be still studied with this? Not just South Africa, but generally race and migration. In a sense, World War II is temporary migration, I suppose, isn't it? So what more work can be done? Because we talk about, for example, the Tuskegee Airmen or the whatever it would be, but the moving through different cultures. What can be done? What areas should we be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's temporary migration, although sometimes it does lead to longer term migration. So certain people's wartime experience often influences what they do after the war. As I kind of began into this research with. I mean, I think for me, one thing that and I know I'm mostly focused on the British Empire. I mean, I guess that's just my area of interest. But I think it is really useful to bring together these various home front stories because there's a lot of similarities to them, So, and I, in thinking about how to kind of do this broader work that I'm trying to do, without the framing of a one home front, it's pretty difficult because there's a huge amount of information and research to do. But I guess I've ended up taking a kind of thematic approach, and so I do think there is something there. It's difficult to do this kind of work though because of the kind of logistical problems of researching in all these different countries and so on, and that kind of expertise that you would need. But I do think, I mean, increasingly you see in some ways the kind of military side of the war, the economic side of the war, political, diplomatic, most of that is kind of, you see a lot of really great kind of global work done in that realm. And I think for the reasons I've described, it's more difficult to do that looking at the home front experience. Not impossible. Yeah. And I think, some people have definitely made some good strides in that direction, but I think that's what what I'd like to see the most, and that I'm hoping to contribute to, in my work.
Thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions. So Daniel Hammersby is just referring to what we said earlier. Were the hospitals in South Africa segregated for the wounded coming back from Burma? Is that something you've found out the answer to?
I haven't encountered any direct information about that, although my assumption is that they would have been. But then I'd need to know more about what, how exactly the system of, I haven't looked into this. I don't know, like how exactly were they organized? Because I'm presuming there would have been military hospitals. So, would they have been, how, would there have been separate facilities for troops from different parts of the empire? I'm not really sure, regardless of kind of racial segregation.
As far as I know, there kind of were. There were, certainly we know in the American military, black African American nurses couldn't treat white officers and white. But with the British Empire, it gets a lot more complicated, and we'd have to ask Robert Lyman or someone about how the 14th Army worked in Burma, because the whites were the minority in the 14th Army. The great majority were Indian and West African and Gurkhas and everybody else. So I guess there would have been no possibility in Burma in the theatre to keep everything completely separate, because it would have been impossible. But I guess on the ships, and when you start getting further away from the front line, it would have been more complicated. But the other question, we're just going to leave it on this one, from Andrew Bolton. Any funny stories you encountered during your research regarding kind of the cooperation between communities?
Yeah, I mean, so building on the Australian soldiers hijacking the beer truck, they seem to have had all kinds of crazy exploits on one visit. I think there's all these stories of them cutting a policeman's braces, and I don't know, it sounds like they were just kind of going a bit wild in Cape Town, which is often the stories that I've kind of seen. But I mean, I do sort of that image of them hijacking a beer truck is quite. Yeah, I
mean, I think in my past I've read lots of stories of soldiers passing through, and it's not just Cape Town; it's port towns generally were seen as being a bit more fun. You get the same in Britain, in places like Liverpool, doing a bit more kind of carousing there than perhaps if the troops who are stationed in a quiet Dorset or Devon town would be different. But ports tended to be a bit more raucous. Well, we'll bring the things through. I'm just going to say what we've got coming up tomorrow, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So, folks, tomorrow we are going east to the Red Army. We are looking at the non-standard cadres within the Russian army, so women and also some of the Asian troops from Siberia. So that'll be a really interesting show, because that's another aspect of integration that we don't talk about so much. It's not always about people of color, it's people of different ethnicities, and of course females. So that's tomorrow. But I'm going to bring Jean back in to say goodbye, really. So it's been really good. So have you enjoyed talking to our little happy group of viewers?
Yeah, no, it's been great. Thanks so much for having me on.
Brilliant. Well, we'll leave it there then. So this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying I'll see you all again tomorrow night, talk about the Red Army. Thank you very much, Dr. Jean Smith, and thank you very much for everybody for watching. Cheers, everybody. See you again tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.